Squire Sitten peeped at the hot midday sun from the shade of his front porch. In the distance, 6 of his sons worked busily, digging deep trenches through a swampy area of his homestead that had never been farmed before. But the way Squire figured, a man's got to do what a man's got to do to make a living. After all, living on Boylston Creek had been hard on the old-timer. It all started 2 years ago when Squire took out a small loan from his neighbor, Mr. Carr, to pay some back taxes on his farm. Now, Mr. Carr was a wealthy man who just so happened to be the owner of a small bank over in Asheville. He told Squire to take his time and pay him back whatever he could, and the 2 men shook hands, and the deal was struck without any paperwork. After all, that was a neighborly thing to do, since Squire had helped Mr. Carr out countless times in the past. Well, anyway, the following year after the loan, there was a terrible drought that swept through the entire section, and nearly everybody's crops had failed, including Mr. Carr's. Heck, most folks barely survived. However, Squire had some of the best farmland there was in the county, and most of his crops made it to harvest. Yet, the good neighbor gave most of his food away and helped nearly everybody in his area make it through the crisis. You see, Squire had been raised that way, to help anyone out when they needed it, and that when you looked a man in the eye and you shook his hand, that your word was your unbreakable bond, a promise that could never be broken. But last fall, I tell you never seen a man madder than the old Squire when he was served papers from the courthouse signed by a judge, stating that Mr. Carr had been awarded 10 acres of the old Squire's most fertile farmland as restitution for non-payment of the small loan. That low-down scoundrel, the old Squire scowled presently as he sat on the porch. He took everything I had. I should have known better than to ever have trusted a banker. And it was for that reason that Squire had his boys digging ditches to drain the swampy patch of ground that had never been cultivated before. He had to drain it so as to be able to plant his crops next month. Now, I need to pause here for just a moment, folks. You see, all the stories I tell on this channel are true, including this one. But I'm fairly certain that what I'm about to tell you is going to blow your mind. And you're probably going to think to yourself, well, I ain't never heard that before. Well, my response to that is, well, that's good. That's what this channel is all about, bringing lost history back to life. Anyways, prepare yourself for the facts that come next. Out in the field, the boys were working their manual drag lines on the sloppy gumbo muck. They had already hit a few veins of lime, and it appeared the rich soil would easily support crops once they got it dried up. Just then, the oldest boy, Earl, struck something hard. He used his shovel to remove the mud from around the rock, when he noticed it kind of looked like a foot. By now, the other boys had joined in, and more excavation revealed that this rock was extremely large. So they kept on digging, and when Earl finally jumped down in the pit and took his hands rubbing the mud away, it was suddenly revealed that the face of a petrified man was looking right back up at him. Not caring to see any more, Earl scrambled out of that ditch like a scalded cat in one jump. "Pa, come quick, come look at this." After examining the strange figure, the Squire decided to hook up some ropes and a pulley system to his mule, and they pulled the mysterious relic from the bowels of the earth. They loaded it on a wagon and took it back to the cabin, where they cleaned it up, and what they found was astonishing. It was a man with a very detailed face, frozen in time. He was 5 foot 10 inches tall, with feet so big that they would have taken a size 15 boot. But who was he? And just how and when did he get there? Hey guys, JD here. Click the link below to check out my new book. It's full of stories just like the one you're listening to right now. Now, back to the story. Now, back in 1903, the radio hadn't made its way onto the market yet, but word still spread the old-fashioned way, by wagging tongues. And boy, I tell you, by the next day, Squire Sitton's homestead was the talk of Henderson County, North Carolina. Folks traveled from as far as 40 miles away by horse and wagon to get a glimpse of the petrified man. Several doctors and newspapers were on the scene and verified that this was indeed a petrified human. Several speculated that it was a British soldier from the American Revolution, since they found a petrified bullet nearby. Others claimed that it was their long-lost relative who had disappeared many years ago. Over 100 people were able to describe the details of just how and when the relative disappeared and just so happened to be found on Boylston Creek. Widows from all over Henderson County developed a fondness for the petrified man. Every widow in this section of the country whose husband had disappeared burst out into tears and said, "There's my Tom," or "There's my Bill," or "There's my dear John." One woman said, "I know him by his dear feet." Another woman said, "I know that's my husband because he had a scar on his leg. And look at the petrified man. He has a scar on his leg." I tell you, it got so bad that after a while, Squire Sitton had to get a guard to keep watch day and night to keep the widows from coming and bodaciously eloping with the petrified man. For weeks on end, the crowds kept coming when it suddenly dawned on Squire that folks might be willing to pay a pretty penny to see this petrified man. Oh, dollar signs flashed in his eyes, and the old Squire suddenly took to liking the man in stone as if he were his own flesh and blood. He even dressed the petrified man in the best clothing that the wily old man could find. And, as it turns out, he was right. Folks lined up by the hundreds, paying 1 dime each for a peek at the famous man. Soon, the crowds at Boylston Creek had died down. So the Squire started taking the petrified man on tour to nearby towns before finally making his way to the big city of Asheville. Now, the day he rolled into Asheville, his prized possession was resting gently on a bed of straw in the back of his wagon, and it turned into a spectacle that no one forgot during their lifetimes. The approach of the petrified body was heralded by horsemen who had passed the farm wagon on the road. A curious crowd assembled there and considered it a privilege to pay 10 cents to gaze upon the stony countenance. The entire procession could be seen coming up Biltmore Avenue. A string of dirty-faced urchins ran behind the wagon and jeered as the Squire rode majestically through the streets. Napoleon in all his glory couldn't have entered a city more triumphantly than the old farmer did. A passel of dogs were excited by the commotion, attending to the wagon's entry in the city that was preceded by 2 horses drawing the funeral coach. Their barking was augmented by the cries of children following the wagon, so loud that it caused storekeepers to desert their shops. Patrons of saloons rushed to the doorway to ascertain the cause of the confusion. Within moments, a group of 150 people stood near the wagon, and after securely fastening his horses to a hitching post in front of the courthouse, Squire Sitton stood up on the driver's seat and cleared his throat and began an oration worthy of a circus barker. "Ladies and gentlemen, step right up. 1 dime to take 1 look." Oh, his talk brought instant results. People began to file past him and fill his palm with shiny dimes. As the day grew, so did the crowd of spectators. Heck, by 1 hour he had made over $35. Across the street from the courthouse, looking out the window, was the old crooked banker man himself, who had ripped off Squire and stole his land. He said to his assistant, "Look how much money he's making. Something's got to be done." So the banker stepped outside for a closer look. Both the Squire's pockets were bulging and spilling over, with both fists full of money. The cowardly banker timidly approached the owner of the freakish exhibit and offered him $500 to purchase the petrified man. But the Squire, he never even looked down at him. "That's right, ladies and gentlemen. Step right up, 10 cents each." The banker raised his voice. "I'll give you $1,000. But Squire, he kept right on collecting dimes from the scores of curious folks. $3,500, old man, and that's more than your entire property's worth. I'll give you cash right now, out of the vault." "Well, that's more like it," the cunning mountain man said, without any expression on his face. And just like that, Squire Sitten sold the mysterious petrified man to the greedy banker who had stole his land for $3,500. And that, my friend, was a fortune in 1903. The banker quickly got to work, establishing a legal business, and he named it the Pristine Petrified Phenomenon Company, whose sole asset was the petrified man. During the following days, dimes continued to flow into the coffers of the newly organized company. The interest in the freak, however, began to wane as days of the exhibition entered into weeks. Business was lacking, so arrangements were made to exhibit the man on the Murphy branch of the Southern Railway. A tour of several weeks in the Murphy, North Carolina section was profitable, but it was clear that the Pristine Petrified Phenomenon Company needed more fertile grounds. Suddenly, the banker had a grand idea. You see, back then, well, much like today, the capital of freak shows was New Orleans, and there was a huge exhibition about to take place there. Surely the banker would make a fortune if he took his prized possession there. No, the petrified man was taken to the Southern Railway station in grand style. He was placed atop on one of the finest carriages available and driven through the streets like a celebrity on the way to the train. The banker man wasn't content with trusting his prized possession to the baggage car, so the stone man was taken first class in the day coach. Once he arrived to the Big Easy, he quickly left his investment safely in his hotel room and set out to scope the city, looking for the best spot to display his investment. And the city was electric with excitement. Tents were set up all through the downtown, showcasing freaks of nature in every possible imagination. Yep, the banker was floored by what he saw next. There before him was a 10-cent booth from Iowa, set up with the exact same petrified man as his. How could this be? Someone had to make a copy of this. What a fraud, he thought, and he set out briskly walking towards the police station. But in that moment, there was another booth from Canada with the exact same stone relic, and then another booth from California, and then Mexico, and literally dozens of other booths, all set up with the exact same man that he had paid $3,500 for. And worst of all of these booths were selling it as a build-it-yourself kit for $25. Furious and devastated at the same time, the banker got back on the train, bound for North Carolina. But this time on the way back, his petrified man rode in the baggage department. Once he arrived back in Asheville, he sued Squire Sitten for fraud, and a trial went on for days that turned into national news. Promises of surprise witnesses maintained interest in the hearing. Witness after witness testified that the man was made of concrete. But equally as many witnesses, including 3 prominent Asheville physicians, testified that he wasn't made out of concrete, but on the contrary, he was a normal human being. And finally, after 3 weeks, litigation in the case was dropped against Mr. Sitten. The banker, though, well, he went bankrupt, and Mr. Sitten bought all his land back at public auction for $3,200. As for the petrified man, well, for many years he remained in the basement of a local funeral home before being sold to a local doctor who kept him in his basement. And as the decades went by, the petrified man's head and his arm fell off, revealing his steel rebar framework. Old Squire Sitten had successfully pulled off one of the greatest cons and revenge stories in the history of North Carolina. Till next time, my friends, be sure to hit that like and subscribe button for more true stories from Appalachia's past.